Every criminal case generates two stories: the story the evidence actually supports and the story that gets told. I'm Melissa Deadrich, and this is Mind Motive Media. Welcome back to episode 2 of Mind Motive Media. I'm glad you're back here with me. Today, I picked a case that's fairly complicated, and this has a bunch of layers, so bear with me and let's dive in. There's a case from 2007 that most people think they already understand, but the version most people remember, one woman wrongly convicted, eventually acquitted, is not actually the full story. Because this case was really a story about a media campaign, a set of cognitive errors, a legal system, and a prosecutor, all failing in the same direction at the same time. So let's go back to November 1st, 2007 in Perugia, Italy. 21-year-old British exchange student Meredith Kercher was found brutally murdered in her bedroom, sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled. But within days of Meredith's murder, attention shifted almost entirely away from Meredith and onto her 20-year-old American roommate, who, along with her Italian boyfriend, very quickly became the center of the investigation and the center of the story. But this episode is not about that 20-year-old American. It's really about the 8 years of legal chaos that played out on the international stage. Convictions, appeals, acquittals, reconvictions, and final acquittals, all while the media narrative grew larger than the actual evidence. The procedural details, the interrogation, the man whose DNA was actually all over the crime scene, the false confession that put another innocent man in jail, we'll cover those too. They're important because the real question, the one this episode is built around, is this: how did this case progress in the Italian legal system for as long as it did? And to understand it, we need to start with the first 2 of the 4 failures: the media framing and behavioral interpretation. Because by the time most people encountered this case, the narrative had already been psychologically constructed for them. And here's how. Within days of Meredith Kercher's murder, the media gave the 20-year-old American roommate a nickname, one not created by evidence or testimony or forensic analysis. The media dug up that nickname from her childhood soccer years, took it out of context, and twisted it to construct a salacious media narrative around it. That nickname, Foxy Knoxy. And that's the only time I'm going to use that nickname. And I'm only using it because it became one of the most influential framing devices in this entire case. So from here forward, I'm just going to call it the nickname. So once the nickname was pulled into international coverage, audiences everywhere had a ready-made character template. Sexually adventurous, manipulative, possibly dangerous, definitely off. And once that twisted narrative frame existed, everything that 20-year-old American girl did was interpreted through it. Kissing her boyfriend outside the police station became evidence of emotional abnormality. Stretching during long waits at the police station became evidence of deviance. And buying clothes after her apartment became a sealed crime scene became evidence of callousness. But there's a big problem with that. There's no universal grief response. People do not all respond to trauma in the same way. And research consistently shows that humans, including trained professionals, are actually very poor at determining guilt or innocence from behavior alone. There's no reliable, generalizable behavioral signature of guilt. What there is, though, is trauma response. And that can look like dissociation, shock, emotional numbing, automatic behavior, dark humor, and inappropriate affect. Acute trauma can make people appear detached, flat, confused, or emotionally inconsistent. But instead of considering any type of trauma response, the media chose to take a 20-year-old American woman in a foreign country whose roommate of about 2 months had just been brutally murdered and turn her into a pariah. And while that was all starting, she didn't even understand she was becoming the focus of the investigation. Her behavior was being interpreted publicly as suspicious, but it was really not unusual. And this is where one of the major cognitive errors in the case enters the picture: attribution error. We talked about this in the last episode, where you take someone's behavior as representative of their personality without considering any of the circumstances or context surrounding their behavior. So people looked at this 20-year-old American and thought, she's acting wrong. She doesn't look upset enough. She seems strange. And from there, people jumped to character conclusions. She must be manipulative, cold, dangerous, guilty, instead of considering the context surrounding that behavior, which was traumatized, sleep deprived, in shock, culturally out of place, psychologically overwhelmed. But once people emotionally committed to the idea that that 20-year-old American was suspicious, new information was interpreted in ways that reinforced that theory instead of challenging it. That's confirmation bias. In this case, it's full of it. Because once investigators, media outlets, and audiences emotionally accepted Knox as the center of the story, any contradictory evidence stopped weakening the narrative. Instead, contradictory evidence was reinterpreted to preserve the narrative. But here's the important part. This wasn't just happening in public opinion. It was happening inside a legal system that was not insulated from media influence in the way American audiences often assume courts are. And that brings us to the third major failure: the structure of the legal system itself. And to understand how a case like this one could unfold the way it did, we have to step out of an American legal mindset. Because a lot of what frustrated, confused, and even outraged American audiences in this case comes down to one fundamental fact. The Italian legal system is structurally not the American legal system. Now, one is not necessarily better or worse than the other. They're just structurally different. But they're also psychologically and procedurally different in ways that most people never think about. So first, the United States uses an adversarial system, and Italy does not. Not really, anyway. So in the United States, police and investigators build the factual case. They work the scene, collect the evidence, interview witnesses, and then their work is turned over to the prosecutors, who have to decide whether formal charges can be filed. And if they can, the prosecutors then have to prove that case in court, where the prosecution and the defense are on opposing sides, essentially battling it out in front of a judge, acting primarily as a neutral referee, and a jury, usually of 12 people who independently decide guilt or innocence. Italy's system, on the other hand, was originally an inquisitorial system rooted in civil law tradition, though by 2007 it had been reformed to include a few adversarial features, notably public trials, cross-examination, and defense participation. But it still held on to a few important inquisitorial features. One of those was the role of the prosecutor. Italian prosecutors are magistrates. They're part of the judiciary, not just courtroom advocates. So during preliminary investigation, the prosecutors work directly with the judicial police. The police don't just build a case independently and hand it over to the prosecutor. They're often investigating under the prosecutor's direction or delegation. Now, in theory, that role is supposed to be truth-seeking. The prosecutor is supposed to be looking for evidence that supports guilt or evidence that could support innocence. But psychologically, that creates a risk. Because if a prosecutor becomes committed to an early theory, that theory can influence what investigators look for, how evidence is interpreted, and which facts are treated as important. And because the prosecutor is structurally embedded in the investigation, the theory becomes part of the architecture of the case very early. And remember that point because it becomes important later on. Another difference is the role of the judges. Italian judges play a more active role than many Americans are used to. They're not just referees sitting back while two sides fight it out. They can supervise parts of the investigation. They can authorize investigative steps. They can question witnesses. They can review evidence. And essentially, they can shape how the case moves forward. So from an American point of view, the boundaries look pretty blurry. And that's where the legal structure and psychology really start to overlap. Because the system can be formally committed to truth-seeking, but still be vulnerable to confirmation bias. Then there's the trial structure itself. Italy does not use an American-style jury of 12 peers. In serious criminal cases, Italy uses what's called a corte decise, a mixed panel. 2 professional judges sit alongside 6 lay judges, ordinary citizens, and they deliberate together as one group and come up with one verdict together. But the lay judges, they're not separated from the broader media environment. They're not always shielded from publicity the way a highly controlled or sequestered American jury might be. And then finally, double jeopardy is a big difference because in the United States, once someone is acquitted, prosecutors generally don't get another chance. The government doesn't get to keep appealing until it gets the answer it wants. But Italy works differently. Both sides, the defense and the prosecution, can appeal. And that includes appealing acquittals, which in and of itself is an issue. But Italy's appeals themselves are structurally different because in the United States, an appeal is a legal error review. The appellate court reads the record and asks whether the trial court made a mistake. Was there a wrong jury instruction? Was there inadmissible evidence? Was counsel ineffective? But they don't rehear witnesses and they don't reweigh evidence. They also don't issue their own verdict on guilt. If they find an error, they typically send the case back for a new trial. And in Italy, the intermediate appellate court conducts what's essentially a second trial. They can re-examine evidence. They can rehear witnesses, and they can issue their own verdict on guilt or innocence. They can convict someone the trial court acquitted. So it's not about, did the lower court make a mistake? It's more about, we're going to decide for ourselves. And then above that sits Italy's highest court, the Court of Cassation, which is like our U.S. Supreme Court, and it reviews legal questions rather than facts. The difference is when the Court of Cassation finds something wrong, it doesn't send the case back to the trial court. It sends it back to a different appellate panel for another full appellate retrial. Okay, that's a lot. That's just a lot of legal stuff. So to put it all together before we move on, there are 4 key differences, right? The prosecutor is embedded in the investigation. They're not separate from it. 2, the judges are active participants. They're not neutral referees. 3, the verdict comes from a mixed panel of professional judges and lay judges deliberating together, not from an independent jury alone in a deliberation room. And then 4th, appeals are second trials that either side can pursue, not error reviews limited to defendants. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of the structure we're dealing with, Let's look deeper, because structures don't fail by themselves. People operate inside them. And here, one person stood at the center of how that structure was used. Remember when I said earlier that a prosecution early theory can get embedded in a case and become part of the case architecture? Here's where that comes back. The lead prosecutor on the Meredith Kercher murder case was Giuliano Mignini. And it's important to understand what Mignini was already doing and what he was already known for before Meredith Kercher was ever murdered. Because Mignini already had a documented history of constructing highly unusual criminal theories. And it started with one of the most infamous unsolved cases in modern Italian history, the Monster of Florence. Beginning in 1968 and ending abruptly in 1985, a serial killer was operating in the hills around Florence. 8 couples, 16 people were murdered, almost always young lovers parked in cars in remote areas at night. The killer used the same .22 caliber Beretta pistol across nearly every attack. The female victims were mutilated in a signature ritualistic way. The killer was never definitively identified, but Italian investigators cycled through suspects and theories for years. And when Giuliano Mignini took over a piece of the investigation in the early 2000s, the prevailing official theory inside his office was that the Monster of Florence murders were not the work of a lone killer. Mignini believed they were ritual killings, committed on behalf of a wealthy, hidden, satanic sect that was made up of doctors, lawyers, public officials, and other respectable members of Tuscan society, who commissioned the murders to obtain female body parts for use in occult ceremonies. Let that sink in. The lead prosecutor's working theory was a satanic cult of elite Italians ordering ritual murders. Over the years, Mignini investigated or prosecuted over a dozen people connected to that theory. Doctors, pharmacists, a medical examiner, public officials, all using his satanic conspiracy theory. And yet none resulted in lasting convictions tying anyone to the Monster of Florence murders. But Mignini didn't stop there. He also went after the people who publicly questioned his theory, specifically Mario Spezzi, an Italian crime journalist who had covered the Monster of Florence case from the very beginning, over 2 decades, and was widely considered the expert journalist on the case. Spezzi did not believe Mignini's satanic sect theory. He thought the evidence pointed to a lone killer, and he said so publicly. He even co-wrote a book with American thriller writer Douglas Preston called The Monster of Florence, which directly contradicted the prosecution's narrative. Mignini's response? He had Spezzi and Preston investigated for the murders themselves. Spezzi was arrested in 2006 and jailed for over 3 weeks, including several days in solitary confinement, before being released. Preston was interrogated by Mignini and warned he could face charges, so he left Italy and didn't return for years. Now, around this same time in 2006, Mignini himself came under investigation by prosecutors in Florence for abuse of office and illegal wiretapping, accusations that he had misused his powers and tapped the phones of journalists, investigators, and others who were questioning his Monster of Florence theories. To be clear, none of this automatically invalidates every decision he made, and in fairness, he was entitled to the same due process as defendants were. But it wasn't the same process, and patterns matter. Because the pattern in Mignini's career, by the time the Meredith Kercher case landed on his desk, was a consistent one. Complex conspiracy narratives involving ritual or sexual motivation, heavy reliance on behavioral interpretation rather than forensic proof, a strong emotional commitment to a theory, even after evidence pushed in a different direction, and a willingness to pursue people, defendants, journalists, critics, who got in the way of that theory. That's the prosecutor in this case. So let's pull all the threads back together. We talked about the media construction, the nickname, the character template. We talked about the cognitive biases. We talked about the Italian legal structure and the prosecutor. And each of those alone can be a serious problem. But together, they formed something far more dangerous in Perugia in 2007. Because within hours of Meredith Kercher's body being found, Mignini was already inside that investigation. Thanks to the structure of the Italian system, this prosecutor that was publicly known for his crazy theories of an unsolved serial killer case, who was under formal criminal indictment in Florence, and who was known for pursuing critics who challenged him, he was allowed to operate inside that Italian legal structure. And that structure gave him and his office significant investigative power and embedded them inside that case from the very first hours. There was no separation between the police building a case and the prosecutor deciding what to do with it. The theory of the crime began forming immediately with Mignini leading the charge. And so knowing that, it's no surprise, really, that within days, Amanda Knox and her Italian boyfriend, Raffaele Sollecito, became the focus, the target. And Knox was interrogated, not interviewed, interrogated repeatedly over a period of several days in Italian, a language she'd studied but was not fluent in. And at key moments, she didn't have an attorney or a qualified interpreter present. And by a lot of estimates, she had been interrogated for more than 50 cumulative hours over several days. And during an overnight interrogation session in the days after Meredith Kercher's murder, Knox signed a statement that implicated her employer, Patrick Lumumba. But then almost immediately afterward, she wrote a second statement saying she didn't trust what she had just said because she was exhausted, confused, and under intense stress. But that second statement was practically ignored. Patrick Lumumba was arrested, jailed, and publicly tied to the murder. But meanwhile, the actual forensic evidence was already pointing somewhere else. Because by November 19th, and remember, Meredith's body was found late November 1st, early November 2nd. So then by November 19th, the DNA that was found in Meredith Kercher's bedroom, on her body, and in bloody footprints and biological traces at the scene was linked almost unquestionably to one person, Rudy Guede. Now, under the Italian structure we just walked through, the prosecutor's early theory can sometimes become the case's working architecture. And here it did. It took on Mignini's historically consistent theory pattern: a sexually motivated group attack, a ritualistic framing, multiple defendants acting together for transgressive reasons, and a young American woman at the center of the narrative whose behavior was read as evidence of guilt. So even after the forensic evidence overwhelmingly tied Guede to the crime scene, and even after Lumumba was released and exonerated, Knox and Sollecito remained central targets of the prosecution. That theory of a multi-defendant ritualistic crime did not get abandoned. It just got reshaped. And then the Italian legal structure did what we described it could do. In 2009, it convicted Knox and Sollecito. Then it appealed. And in 2010, while Knox and Sollecito were sitting in an Italian prison, awaiting their appeal process, 1 year after their initial conviction, Mignini himself was convicted at trial in the Florence proceedings for abuse of office. He was sentenced to 16 months. But he continued working as a prosecutor throughout his personal ordeal and against Knox and Sollecito in the murder of Meredith Kercher. Then in 2011, Knox and Sollecito's appeal process ended in an acquittal, but a new trial was ordered by the Court of Cassation. And in 2014, Knox and Sollecito were reconvicted. In March of 2015, 8 years after Meredith Kercher's death, they were finally and definitively acquitted of Meredith Kercher's murder. That was 8 years in which Knox and Sollecito remained either in prison or under the cloud of conviction. 8 years in which the initial prosecution theory kept resurrecting itself through Italy's appellate process. 8 years in which the media narrative that was built around a nickname and a behavioral template and no forensic evidence never really faded because the legal process kept giving it oxygen. And when all 4 of these systems failed together, real people absorbed the damage. Let's start with Patrick Lumumba. He was Knox's employer, a father, a husband, a working musician, arrested based on a statement produced during an overnight interrogation, spent 2 weeks in prison before his solid alibi was confirmed. He'd been at his own bar that he owned and operated. He was in front of witnesses on the night of the murder. But by then, his bar had been seized. His business never recovered. His reputation in Perugia was permanently altered. So he eventually left Italy and relocated with his family to Poland. And Lumumba has consistently said publicly that he does not view himself and Knox as victims of the same system. He personally blames Knox for what happened to him. And honestly, he's entitled to that. Having your life and livelihood destroyed by a false accusation certainly earns him the right to feel however he wants to feel about it. But what about the guy who actually killed Meredith, Rudy Guede, the man whose DNA was found on Meredith's body, in her bedroom, in bloody footprints at the scene? The man the Italian courts ultimately concluded killed Meredith Kercher. He was convicted in a fast-track trial in 2008. No fanfare, no nothing. And then he was originally sentenced to 30 years. But because of Italy's fast-track system, his sentence was reduced to 16 years on appeal. He served 13 of those years and was out on parole by the end of 2021. And then in 2023, he was arrested again on charges of sexual assault and abuse against a former girlfriend. He was placed under house arrest, and as of this recording, he's still in the Italian legal system. But if you ask people about the Meredith Kercher case, many people can't even name him. And then there's Amanda. Despite being acquitted of the murder, she still remains convicted of slander against Patrick Lumumba, based on that statement that she produced during that overnight interrogation. Even though the European Court of Human Rights ruled in 2019 that Italy violated her rights during the original interrogation, especially her right to a lawyer and to a qualified interpreter. In 2023, that same court issued a second ruling specifically targeting the slander conviction, finding those proceedings similarly tainted. That ruling cleared the way for Italy to hold a new slander trial, but they convicted her again in 2024. And then that conviction was upheld by Italy's Supreme Court in 2025. So think about that. A coerced statement produced under conditions a European Human Rights Court found unlawful is still, nearly 20 years later, the basis of an active criminal conviction against her. And then there's Giuliano Mignini, the prosecutor at the center of it all. His 2010 conviction for abuse of office was annulled on appeal in 2011, and the charges ultimately dropped on statute of limitations grounds. They ran out of time. He never spent a day in prison. He was permitted to continue working as a prosecutor, even while he was having his own trial and appeals for abuse of office. He eventually rose to the chief prosecutor of Perugia position before retiring in 2020. And in recent interviews, he's continued to defend his original theory of the Meredith Kercher case. even while expressing what he's described as personal regret about the toll it took on Knox. But the most important ripple effect was on Meredith Kercher, the youngest of 4 children in a close family in London. Friends and classmates described her as warm, funny, gentle, sharp, and deeply loved. She'd only been in Perugia for about 2 months when she was murdered. The ripple effect on her family has been profound. Her mom, Arlene, suffered from declining health for years during the legal proceedings. And those proceedings required the family to travel to Italy repeatedly and sit through testimony about their daughter's death, as well as answer questions from a press corps that was overwhelmingly interested in someone else. Her dad, John, was a freelance journalist. He spent the rest of his life trying to keep his daughter's name and identity at the center of her own story. In essence, he was fighting against the very industry he'd worked in. In 2012, he published a book called Meredith, Our Daughter's Murder and the Heartbreaking Quest for the Truth, which is the closest thing to a portrait of Meredith as a person that exists in the public record. It's in the show notes, and it's worth a read. John and Arlene Kercher both died in 2020 without ever seeing their daughter restored to the center of her own story in the public imagination. Meredith's brothers have largely stayed out of public view, but at times have joined the family in pleading for the case to be remembered as Meredith's case, not as someone else's. Meredith's sister has become the family's public voice in recent years. She has spoken with extraordinary restraint about what it's like to watch your sister become a footnote in coverage of her own murder, about what it's like to receive media requests that aren't really about Meredith at all, and about being asked over and over to comment on someone else's story. The painful truth of the ripple effect for the Kercher family is this: the legal process never gave them what families of murder victims are usually told they'll receive. There was no clean conviction story. There was no definitive courtroom moment of closure. The man whose DNA tied him overwhelmingly to the crime scene served a reduced sentence and was released in 2021. The legal saga around Knox and Sollecito consumed almost all of the public oxygen for 8 years. The Kercher family has, for the better of 2 decades, asked the world to remember their daughter, but the world has mostly remembered someone else. That's the ripple effect. People whose lives were permanently rearranged, and one prosecutor who walked away with his career and his theory intact. That's why I'm bringing this case up 20 years later. It's not celebrity, it's not spectacle, and it's not internet debates about whether someone seems likable. The people were all real. The damage was real, and the cost was permanent. What forensic psychology offers in cases like this is not certainty, and it's not hero versus villain storytelling. It's a more psychologically honest way of asking questions. What evidence actually existed? What assumptions got layered on top of it? And what happened when those assumptions became emotionally convincing before they became factually reliable? And whether we recognize the next case like this in time depends on whether we've learned how to look and how to ask questions. And that's a wrap on this episode of Mind Motive Media. If this is the kind of analysis that you've been looking for in the true crime space, I'd love for you to follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And if you leave a review, it genuinely helps other people find the show, so thank you in advance for that. You can also find me on the socials, primarily Insta, if you want to continue the conversation there. Next episode, we're going to look at what happens when an interrogation produces a confession the evidence cannot support, but a system convicts anyway. I'll see you next time.